Okay, so imagine this. The conversation's flowing, you're making plans, and you feel like, there's a real connection. And then just nothing. No warning, no fight, not even a text that says this isn't working. Just silence. It's that signature kind of brutal fade out we see all the time now, and it just leaves this ringing void.
It does. And that void is where we usually focus all our attention
Right.
on the person who's been left hanging, trying to make sense of it all. But for this deep dive, we're going to flip that around. We're going to focus on the person who pulls the plug. And this isn't about blame. It's really about trying to understand the psychological mechanics of avoidance.
Yeah, to really unpack that silent exit, like what is happening in that moment that makes someone pull their hand back from the keyboard? What's the mental math that says disappearing is the best option?
Well, to start, you have to realize just how common this is. There was a study back in 2018 that found something really telling. Around 25% of people said they'd been ghosted in a romantic relationship. But right behind that, 22% admitted that they had been the one to do the ghosting.
That symmetry is everything, isn't it? It basically means there's a really high chance that the person who ghosted you has also been on the receiving end. It's this like widespread cycle. And it's so easy to just write off that 22% as, careless or immature. But the truth is often a lot deeper. It's rooted in things like mental exhaustion or just being completely emotionally drained.
And that's the fundamental shift in perspective we're talking about. If you're the one who disappears, you're usually not running from the other person. You're running from the pressure the connection represents, or maybe just the pressure of the conversation you think you're supposed to have.
That is such a key distinction. I mean, if you're already burnt out, your tank is just empty from work, family, whatever. Even a simple friendly text can feel like this massive chore. The other person could be great, but their need for a response feels like this overwhelming demand on a system that's already, crashing.
And that's what starts what we could call the internal delay spiral. It's so relatable. It begins with this little promise you make to yourself. I'm just too tired to deal with this right now. I'll reply later.
Oh, I know that feeling. I'll do it when I have the energy. But later just doesn't come. The delay stretches from hours to days and maybe a week. And suddenly the silence is so loud that reaching out feels, it feels weird and humiliating. You just think, I can't possibly explain this now. It's been too long.
Exactly. It's no longer a failure to care. It becomes a total failure of energy management. But the consequences are real. For the person on the other end, it's confusion, it's self-doubt. And for the ghoster, they miss a chance to build a really crucial life skill: mature communication. They end up creating these wounds when all they really wanted was a bit of quiet.
Let's follow that because it leads right to the avoidance calculation. When you really dig into why people choose silence, the main driver is almost always a fear of guilt, a terror of being the bad guy.
The internal monologue is so clear, isn't it? Something like, if I'm honest and say I'm not interested, I'll have to see them get hurt, and that will make me feel awful. Or, if I tell them the real reason, I'll sound selfish. So silence feels like the path of least resistance. You don't have to witness their disappointment.
You just pull the plug. You don't have to absorb their reaction or deal with their feelings. But this is where it gets interesting, because avoiding guilt doesn't actually make it go away. It changes shape.
And that's where this idea of emotional residue comes in. It's like sweeping dirt under a rug. The dirt's still there. It just hardens over time. Emotional residue is that deep shame or regret we carry from moments we just didn't handle well.
That's a really powerful concept. What does that residue actually feel like, say, years down the line?
Well, think of it like an emotional debt. You avoided a 2-minute awkward conversation, but now that debt is on your books. So maybe 5 years later, you see that person in a coffee shop and you get that hot, instant flash of shame. That is the residue. You dodged a moment of pain, but you inherited this long-term dull ache of regret.
And that's got to lead to a huge self-perception hit, right? The ghoster starts telling themselves the story, I'm a coward, or I'm just a bad communicator. So instead of a clean break, they're left with these internal questions like, did I make them feel worthless? Or why do I always run from these things?
And that's why the path to growth here is all about courage. Emotional maturity is just the willingness to sit with the discomfort for a minute. We have to be honest about the impact of our silence, not even for the other person, but for our own psychological health. Taking responsibility is the only way out of that negative loop.
And these patterns, they don't just come from nowhere, do they? They're often echoes from our past. We repeat what we don't repair. What are some of the deeper roots here?
There are two really common ones. The first is what you could call the preemptive strike. Ghosting becomes a way to seize control. You leave before you can be left. It's a way of saying, I get to write the ending to this story.
And the second is that it's just learned behavior. Disappearing feels normal or even safe.
Precisely. If you grew up in a home where difficult emotions were ignored, or maybe even punished, then silence is the only tool you have. You learned early on that expressing yourself just leads to trouble, so your automatic response to any kind of emotional pressure is to freeze up and then flee.
And the more you do that, the more that self-trust gets chipped away. You start to lose the ability to engage in what our sources call kind conflict. We're so wired to see conflict as this terrible, destructive thing.
But it's not. I mean, when it's handled with kindness, conflict is what builds strong relationships. It's about setting boundaries, expressing your needs, handling disappointment with respect. When you ghost, you're reinforcing this really dangerous idea that discomfort equals danger. And that makes true intimacy feel impossible, because intimacy is inherently messy.
We also have to talk about the physical side of this. For some people, that flight response isn't really a conscious choice. It's a gut reaction.
That's such a critical point. Past trauma can literally rewire your nervous system to see emotional intensity as a threat. Your body might react to a partner asking, "So what are we?" with the same fight or flight response it would if someone were screaming at you. The whole system just floods with adrenaline.
So it's not that the person is heartless. Their body is basically screaming at them, "Get out! Flee!"
It's a protective mechanism.
Yeah.
But the hopeful part is that this wiring isn't permanent. It can be changed. You can learn slowly that honesty doesn't always end in disaster. It takes practice sitting with that emotional messiness, one small, hard conversation at a time.
Okay, but now we have to address the big exception. Because we've been talking about ghosting as avoidance, but sometimes it's necessary, right? Sometimes it is the only valid response.
Absolutely. The silent exit isn't always a failure. Sometimes it is the strongest form of self-protection you have. This is where we have to draw a very clear line between avoidance and setting a boundary.
So how do we know the difference? When does silence become a necessary boundary?
It's when you're dealing with someone who is manipulative or abusive, or who just will not respect the boundaries you've already stated. For instance, if you've already said, "I need some space," and their response is to guilt trip you or harass you, well, then silence is the only language they're going to understand.
Or even in the really early stages, right? You go on one or two dates, and the person is immediately showing signs of being inappropriate or overly intense. You're not obligated to give them a formal exit interview.
No, of course not. In those cases, silence is your clearest, safest boundary. If someone has shown you they won't respect your words, you don't owe them any more words. Your peace is what's paramount. Just block them and move on.
So silence in those situations isn't avoidance, it's protection.
Exactly. So really, this whole deep dive is a call for self-honesty. If you see yourself in this profile of the ghoster, it doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you're wrestling with a pattern, one that probably comes from feeling overwhelmed or a deep-seated fear of conflict.
And our goal here was just to shed some light on those patterns and maybe encourage a bit more courage. Because in the end, we all have to choose our discomfort, don't we? It's either the short, sharp discomfort of a difficult conversation now, or the long, dull ache of that emotional residue later.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to take with you. Think about a relationship in your life right now. It could be with anyone, or even with yourself, that you're avoiding because the conversation just feels too heavy.
What emotional strength are you missing out on building? What self-trust could you gain just by choosing to speak clearly instead of disappearing into that silence? That strength is there for you to claim.